Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. And we're back with another edition of our Klub Outside Q&A Round-Up series, where we take a deep dive look at several usually enlightening answers to questions about the wider Bleach lore that come straight from the man himself. As always, Kubo takes and answers a variety of questions directly from fans over on his personal Q&A platform, and then back here, we try to dissect those answers and see if there's anything of value to be found among them. A lot of the time, Kubo's comments are a mix of light-hearted chatter and fluff, but sometimes we are given real, genuine insight into the story and world of Bleach that for whatever reason simply wasn't found in the original material. As before, I'm not going to be looking at every single answer Kubo has ever given, nor even necessarily looking at them in any kind of chronological order. Mostly, I'm trying to curate the answers that I find to be the most interesting and have the most value. And this time the questions revolve around why Yamamoto ended up in Hell, the true scope of Yhwach's ability to bestow Schrifts, Aizen blocking Tessai's Hado 88 during the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, and more. We'll kick things off by discussing the oldest, though still pretty recent, answer of the lot: why Yamamoto ended up in Hell after being killed by Yhwach. As always, a huge thank you goes out to M Shadows for diligently providing translations to these questions and answers. So, let's begin. The first Quincy invasion of the 1000-year Blood War arc comes to a devastating breaking point when a defeated and downtrodden Yamamoto is brutally killed by Yhwach, the Quincy king carving his old nemesis in two with his colossal energy broadsword. It was a shocking moment, one that reverberated throughout the world of Bleach as the Gotei 13 were horrified to sense the sudden death of their leader. Yamamoto manages to cling to life, however, even lying face down in the dirt with half of his body missing. As Yamamoto grabs Yhwach's cloak in a vain attempt to stop him, Yhwach savagely removes Yamamoto's hand before finally annihilating the head captain with a barrage of explosive Quincy arrows from the tip of his finger. Now, based on what we originally thought we knew about the holy arrows of the Quincy, many people assumed that Yamamoto's soul had been completely destroyed here. As when a Quincy kills a hollow with their Heilig file, that hollow is totally removed from existence and from the cycle of rebirth. It's this destructive power that served as the entire foundation for the purging of the Quincy's 200 years ago. But admittedly, the soul erasure of the Quincy arrow has only ever been in relation to use on hollows. And so, in the Hell chapter, when the resurrected Xyloporo revealed that Yamamoto was actually currently residing in Hell, now with the title Court Guard Founder alongside Unohana and Ukitake, and so technically still existing within the cycle of rebirth, some fans wondered how this could be, and called into question how Quincy arrows really work. And so someone took to Kubo's platform asking him how comes Yamamoto is in Hell, as per Xyloporo's words, if he was vaporized by Yhwach's holy arrow. Are Shinigami unaffected by the Quincy's soul erasing ability? It is a pretty pertinent question, as the composition of Quincy arrows has never really been explored before, and nor did it really have a need to be. But I do remember wondering way back in the day if the Shinigami being killed en masse by these arrows were just being obliterated from existence. Anyway, Kubo replied, saying, Quincy arrows were originally designed for hollows, so they cannot erase anything else. And there you have it, surprisingly definitive from the man himself. And to be honest, it makes total sense. The Quincy have had a vendetta against hollows for essentially as long as they've existed, as well as a need to kill them in order to defend themselves from their poisonous Reryoku. But as usual, this does open up the floodgates to some questions. To begin with, the Heilig File then are clearly an invention, essentially, purpose-built to aid the Quincy's in their never-ending battle against the Hollows. But what's the history of the Quincy's Holy Arrow? Do they predate Yhwach or not? Basby is very clearly firing Heilig File in the Friend Saga flashback, and has presumably learned how to use it from a very young age, considering he's only a child here. So, when he began to learn how to use the Heilig File, did his family teach him how to build Quincy arrows that destroy hollows outright, or do his arrows not yet work like that? Kubo's phrasing, saying that the arrows are designed for hollows, does imply some level of control over how they work, implying as well that that function isn't intrinsic to the nature of a Heilig File. If the Quincy's are purposefully designing their arrows to specifically kill hollows and erase them from existence, then does that mean they could potentially design arrows for use against the Shinigami as well? But if that is the case, then I'm surprised that they didn't do that in the 1,000 years they were hiding and watching the Seirete, preparing for war. Honestly, it would be a huge blow to Shinigami morale, if nothing else, come the war, to discover their enemy could make it so they'd never even be reincarnated with a single blast from a well-placed arrow. And here's another question that relates back to the history of the Holy Arrow. Why do the Quincy's need to exterminate the Hollows in such a final way? We know why they do it on an emotional level, but why do they feel the need to purge them like this in a way that threatens the balance of the world? Especially once they knew that their actions were taking such a huge toll on the fate of the universe. If anything, this new revelation by Kubo makes the Quincy even more unsympathetic. If the Quincy could destroy hollows with Heilig File that aren't purpose-built to remove them from existence, then they should have done so when the Shinigami came to them, pleading with them to prevent the collapse of the universe. Because if the Quincy's really are wiping out hollows out of a sense of self-preservation, which is understandable, doesn't sending them to the Soul Society achieve the exact same thing? It removes them from the human world, it makes them no longer a threat, while keeping the balance intact. To me at least, all this revelation does is make the Quincy look both spiteful and immensely selfish. If the only reason they want to erase hollows from the cycle of rebirth as opposed to just exercising them and sending them to the Soul Society is simply their hate for them, then it's definitely harder to see the Quincy's actions as any kind of just, when they could theoretically kill hollows still, regardless, while helping them move on, keeping the universe stable at the same time. And so my final question for this topic is, if the ability to erase a hollow's soul is built into their arrows, presumably at a later date, then what happens when a Quincy builds an arrow or uses an arrow that doesn't yet have that power? At this point, does it function a bit like a Zanpakuto in that it cleanses the hollow soul instead of outright destroying it? Is that even possible for a Quincy's Heilig File to achieve? Either way, on the surface, the answer does make sense to me. It just brings with it a bit of baggage too. But it's nice to know why and how Yamamoto was able to continue within the cycle of rebirth, even if it did cause him to end up in hell instead. Up next, we have another Quincy-focused question, but this time the subject is Yhwach and his power to bestow people a Schrift. Introduced in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, the Schrifts were a power seemingly unique to the Sternritter, a holy word given to them by their god that awakened an incredible power within them. Yhwach has the unique ability to see what people are missing from their souls, what they lack, etched upon their very being as words. By drinking Yhwach's power as part of the ritual to become a Sternritter, the individual has a letter engraved into their souls by Yhwach as he gives them a portion of his power to grant them an ability representative of whatever it is they lack. something that will make them whole. Now, in the source material, the Schrifts are exclusively a Quincy ability. Yhwach is of course the progenitor of the Quincy as we know them, and the Sternritter are all Quincy too. And yet, when you consider what a Schrift actually is, simply the engraving of a word or letter upon someone's soul, there's nothing about that that says it has to be inherently Quincy in nature. And as we've seen, Yhwach has the ability to give and take power freely, giving his power to those who touched him when he was just a baby around 1500 years ago. And so that brings us to the next question: could Yhwach potentially give a Schrift to someone or something that isn't a Quincy in nature? Well, a reader decided to take it to Kubo himself, asking, is it possible to bestow a Schrift to Shinigami, Hollows, or Arankar? The inclusion of Hollows and Arankar in the question definitely makes it a little more interesting too, and while they're not mentioned here, I have to assume that Fullbringer does fall under this blanket as well. Kubo replied, yes, it is possible, if Yhwach wishes to. So, this is very interesting. In a way, I feel like this answer removes some of the individuality of the Sternritter as a faction, but at the same time it does make a lot of sense to me. One of the single biggest complaints surrounding the Schrifts over the years is that they never felt like traditional Quincy abilities, and well, guess what? They're technically not. If anything, this revelation definitely makes Yhwach feel more like a divine being or godly figure, because he can do almost anything. He can bestow power to almost anyone, and presumably turn them into a monstrously strong fighter. Maybe this goes some way to explaining the existence of BG9. Perhaps Yhwach is able to give life to a robotic, inanimate form, although that doesn't really explain why BG9 would have a soul in the first place with which to have a letter engraved into. So maybe BG9 is an empty shell within which someone else's soul was placed, and then Yhwach gave it a Schrift. Maybe it is Xiaolong's soul, but I have no idea how that would even work, how that would come to be, or why Yhwach would see that much potential in Xiaolong's soul to begin with. That being said, this idea of Yhwach being able to give a Schrift to basically anyone makes me wonder just how strong the Vandenreich as a faction would have been if Yhwach had bestowed every single soldat with a Schrift too. Unless you need like a certain amount of power of innate strength in order to be able to wield a Schrift in the first place, but I mean that's not mentioned here. It's interesting though. The ability to give power like this is ostensibly a Quincy ability, in the sense that it is unique to the special Quincy born every 200 years, like Yhwach. But the Schrifts themselves, the individual powers, aren't Quincy abilities at all. It's kind of weird, and it goes back to what I said in an older video about how this new term, power, is introduced in the 1000-Year Blood War arc when referring to what Yhwach specifically can do. He deals mostly in raw, innate power that's unique to the soul, and not something tangible. Since Yhwach's entire character is built around this idea of giving and taking, in the sense that anyone who interacts with Yhwach is basically making a deal with the devil, sometimes unknowingly, as he gives them a portion of his power, but in return he parasitically takes that power and drains their lives and souls from them when they die, or whenever he sees fit, really. Does that mean, were Yhwach to give a Schrift to someone from another race, like a Shinigami, that he would then be able to steal their power and their lives with the Auswählen? Or does the Auswählen only work on those with Quincy blood already running through their veins? But again, that's interesting too, because a Shinigami or a Arankar would still need to drink Yhwach's blood, first of all, to get access to a Schrift, so would that be good enough? It would create a sort of link between them after all, much in the same way as every Quincy within the Vandenreich and pretty much every Quincy ever is connected via Yhwach's blood. Anyway, going back to the Arankar, this is clearly different to how Arankar foot soldiers were given basic Quincy crosses, standard issue crosses, with which to draw a bow from. Again, in Yhwach's eyes, I don't think he would ever dirty his own power by writing on an Arrancar's soul, and certainly I don't think he would let them drink his blood. But if Yhwach did engrave a letter onto an Arrancar's soul, would he be putting himself at risk from their toxic Ryoryoku? After all, tapping into their soul is pretty intimate and feels like it would expose Yhwach somewhat to their makeup. Either way, it would never happen regardless. Finally, does this revelation mean that Yhwach can see words upon all characters in the series? If so, that means every single character in Bleach has their own version of the Sternritter's epithets. I could see Yamamoto being Captain F the Fire, for example, which is kind of weird to think about. Moving on, we have another question centered around Kido, this time looking at really Tessai's only scene of any real significance in the story. During the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, Tessai, revealed to be the commander of the Kido Corps, confronts Aizen along with Urahara after they discover the Vice Captain's treacherous holofication experiments. As Aizen prepares to flee, Tessai attempts to... well, I was going to say stop Aizen, but considering Tessai thought he was just dealing with your average vice captain at the time, it's probably more accurate to say he tries to turn Aizen into paste, using one of the most powerful Kido spells around. Hado 88, Hiryugekizoku Shinten Raiho, which unleashes a massive cannon blast of electrical power at his target. However, Aizen shocks both Kisuke and Tessai by easily blocking the attack using Bakudo 81 Danku, without an incantation, conjuring a huge glass wall and stopping the cannon fire in its tracks. In the wake of the blast, Tessai can't believe his eyes. A vice captain stopping his Hado 88 with a perfectly cast Danku and with no chance to boot is a seemingly impossible feat. As Aizen escapes, Kisuke wonders what on earth he really is. A line that I always expected to be followed up on in some way, but never was. However, a reader has a question pertaining to this scene, asking Kubo the following. During the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, Tessai was shocked when his Hado 88 was stopped by a Danku without a chant from a lieutenant. Would Tessai's Hado 88 have broken through the barrier, ignoring its ability to block all Hado classified 89 and below, if the Danku without a chant had been cast by an average lieutenant instead? Honestly, this is a cool question, if one with a fairly obvious answer, I think. But Kubo replied, saying it would have, and prior to Aizen pulling off the feat, no vice captain had ever used Danku without a chant before. So yeah, as expected, if a regular vice captain had attempted to use Danku without a chant to block Hado 88, the laser beam would have smashed right through the barrier and likely decimated the vice captain. But there's a lot of things at play here. First of all, the Kido proficiency of everyone involved in this scenario needs to be taken into account, as obviously the individual Shinigami have varying degrees of skill. Tessai is a Kido master, perhaps the greatest in all of Soul Society at the time, and so his Hado 88 is likely only capable of being stopped by practitioners already on a similar or at least close level to him. Then there's another question to go along with that. If the so-called average vice captain managed to use the chant for Danku in time, would it then successfully block Hado 88, even if the barrier is cast by a vice captain of supposedly average skill? And finally, what exactly does an average vice captain really mean? Obviously Aizen is and always was on a completely different level, but there are plenty of other vice captains who are very talented in their own different ways, or they specialise in one particular area. For example, Nanao is perhaps the current vice captain who is the most skilled at Kido, but of course in every other way she is nothing like Aizen, so would she still be considered average? Could Nanao use Danku without a chant to block Hado 88, and from Tessai no less? Also, I do find it a little hard to believe that in 1,000 years, not a single vice captain has ever managed to successfully pull off Danku without a chant. Presumably, this isn't including Hachi, as the Kido Corps aren't technically a part of the Gotei. Of course, you'd have to be no slouch to be able to use Bakudo 81 without a chant, and it would require incredible skill from the Vice Captain to wield without the spell, but all it takes is just one to do it over the course of 1,000 years. But hey, I mean, if anyone is going to be the first, let it be Aizen. But yeah, a cool question with what I think was a fairly obvious and straightforward answer. Frankly, I would be way more surprised to learn that an average Vice Captain could block any of Tessai's Kido, chant or not. And finally, to end on a lighter note as always, Kubo spoke a little about his involvement in the process behind the 1,000-Year Blood War Arc anime. He was asked the following. Kubo was asked if he draws bankai illustrations and other materials for the anime staff, and if he plans on releasing them for sale anytime soon. We know already that Kubo has a big role in the creation of the anime, even storyboarding the entire sequence for Senjumaru's bankai in episode 26. I wanted to include that here too, as it really is amazing to see the whole thing laid out before us like that. The art is incredible, the paneling is so good and so very nostalgic to see, and I am so grateful that we got the chance to see it, as it was put on display during the Locus of Brave exhibition. Honestly, seeing this storyboard really makes me miss the manga so very much. But going back to the question at hand, we got a response and it reads as follows. He makes a lot of stuff for the anime, but he doesn't plan on selling any of it. However, he'd like to show the material if given the opportunity. Well, I don't know what kind of an opportunity needs to present itself here, but I would love to see whatever Kubo has been working on behind the scenes. I do wonder in this instance what kind of new material could be shown. Is it just sketches showing off the different bankai as we see them appear in the anime, for example, or perhaps Kubo also worked on scenes like the time we see Shinji use his bankai? Either way, whatever it is, I really hope we see it at some point, even if Kubo doesn't plan on selling any of them. I imagine the images might make their way onto Klub Outside first of all, but we'll have to see if they ever manifest. Alright guys, but that's it for the video, that's it for the latest installment of our Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of the answers given here today. Which one did you find the most interesting, and which did you think had the most value? What do you think of the truth behind the Quincy arrows and how Yamamoto went to hell despite having his body completely destroyed by them? And how do you feel about the revelations surrounding Yhwach's ability to bestow Schrifts upon pretty much anyone? And were you surprised or not to learn that basically no Vice Captain would be able to successfully block Hado 88, certainly not from Tessai, if they tried to use Danku without an incantation? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on all of these topics down in the comments below. And as always, before we end, I want to say a massive thank you and give a huge shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you enjoy what I do here on YouTube and you want to help support the channel and support me even further, you can do just that by supporting me over on Patreon to get your name in the credits like this and to get every video I release absolutely ad-free. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.